Our message is very, very simple. We want to educate the kids, not indoctrinate them.
She doesn't want these projects in her backyard, in Warringah. She wants them in yours.
What's wrong with Australia today?
For me, it's leadership. There's just a lack of leadership.
We should be energy independent here in Australia. We've got everything.
And it's good to see the community come out and really engage in this issue of parental rights.
You only have one vote, but it's very powerful.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Steven Tripp. Thank you everyone who are watching live. I very much look forward to you contributing in the chat, or if you want to call in later, you can do. I'll put the link in the chat for that. If you're watching us on Facebook, Rumble, or YouTube. If you want to watch us later, if you missed this interview, please follow us on Rumble. Rumble's the best way to follow us. Unfortunately, we can't trust YouTube these days, but we've got a big episode today, a very, very important and special guest. So I want to get into that as quickly as possible. But before I do, I just quickly need to get through some housekeeping things. Firstly, if you want to support me on Commanding the Narrative and everything that we do, you can head to Buy Me a Coffee and throw us some donations there if you choose. There's a good way of you having the chance to support me and Commanding the Narrative and all the people involved in Commanding the Narrative. So if you want to head there and support me, you can do it that way, or you can head to the t-shirt shop and get your own Commanding the Narrative t-shirt or ex-candidates t-shirt. Again, it's another way that you can support me and support the ex-candidates as well. And finally, big announcement. I've been talking about the 2024 Environment and Energy Forum coming up at the DYRSL on Sunday, June the 2nd. Big announcement. We've got a very special guest to add to the special guest we've already got locked in, but the one and only Dick Smith will be there to speak. He's going to be joining Senator Malcolm Roberts, the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, Tony Irwin of Nuclear for Australia, Dr. Mark Hove, the president of the Australian Nuclear Association, Professor Stephen Wilson will be there, the Institute of Public Affairs will be there, Dr. Peter Ridd, of course, and also Craig Kelly's going to be there. He's going to be sitting in on the Q&A session. That's about half an hour long. Alexandra Marshall's going to be hosting that. So look, some of the big names in Australian politics and the Australian landscape are going to be at this forum at DY, right in the heart of two teal electorates. So if you can get there, tickets are only $20. There's actually a deal at the moment, two for one. So if you can get there, it would be fantastic, and it should be a great event next Sunday. But on today's interview, I've got a very special guest, and he's coming to us all the way from the UK. But to bring him on and introduce him, I'm going to welcome back a former guest of Commanding the Narrative. His name is Leigh Evans. He's the chairman of CIBUK and also Facts for EU. Leigh, welcome to Commanding the Narrative again.
Thank you, Stephen. Good to see you again.
Yes, it's a busy time in the UK at the moment.
You could say that. We had a snap general election called this week. So let's just say I haven't slept very much.
Yeah, that's understandable. How's everything going with you with CIBUK and Facts for EU? Can you just let everyone know about your websites there?
Yeah, it's really motoring now. It's really ramped up, particularly since the election news has come along. So I would encourage all viewers of yours from around the world, from Australia, wherever, come and have a look at what we're doing. It's It's every day, reports from official sources. You can rely on the information that you're seeing there. And our special guest, as you say, is indeed a special guest. So I don't know whether you want me to introduce him or whether you want to do that.
No, I'll hand it over to you, because obviously you've spent a lot of time with this gentleman, and you're in the UK. That you know what's happening on the ground there, so it might be more suitable for you to give a more detailed introduction than I could possibly do.
Okay, well, I have only known Sir John Redwood for 8 years now, and I recall one weekend 8 years ago when he phoned me up to talk me out of quitting the fight for independence, sovereignty, democracy. I was pretty much at a low ebb at that point, and he just called me out of the blue and he took me out of it. So I've never forgotten that moment 8 years ago. Sir John is, in my view, a remarkable man. He's a businessman, first and foremost, but he is also a former Secretary of State. And what may be of interest to your Australian viewers is that he was also Chief Policy Advisor to Margaret Thatcher, the late Lady Thatcher, and therefore was absolutely at the heart of things when she was formulating policies. And Sir John was an integral part of that. And we can only ever thank him to this day, because without that fundamental change that took place all those years ago, then the UK would be in the doldrums today. So I think we've got a great deal to thank him for. Personally, I want to thank him for his years of service in Parliament. I will bitterly miss him going forward, because he's not going to stand at the next election. But he's got a lot of interesting things to say of relevance to the Australian audience and the worldwide audience, which I think will resonate worldwide. So back to you, Steve.
Well, let's welcome him to the show. Sir John Redwood, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Well, thank you. I look forward to our conversation. I'm full of energy and determination. I want to get out there to a wider world audience. There are battles to win for democracy, for freedom, for free enterprise, for greater prosperity. And the forces against us are mighty. The establishment is not very helpful. And so I'm grateful to you guys for fighting the fight with me and people like me. And we are speaking for millions.
Now, you have been in the Parliament since 1987. You are still full of a lot of vibrance and energy from your opening remarks there. What keeps you motivated to I guess, be a thought leader and to push good policies in Europe and also around the world?
Well, because I've had some wins that show me that if we get our way, we can make things better for people. I want to live in a better, more prosperous, freer world. And I've had enough reversals or enough areas where we haven't won to make me hungry for more success. And each day I get up and think, how can I help make people's lives better? I did that for a long time as an MP, but there are other ways of doing it. And I believe that if we communicate our message and provide a positive opposition to the mistakes and failures of the establishments we both live under, we have a chance of harnessing that might and wisdom of the population, who are so often now out of sympathy with what their world establishment is dishing up for them.
Before we move forward, I want to go back to the past, because you started, as Leigh mentioned, as the chief policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher, who's described as the Iron Lady. We don't have too many leaders nowadays in the Western world that can be described as such a strong figure. But before I get your comments, I want to play a clip of Margaret Thatcher in Parliament. and maybe get your comments afterwards. So we'll just bring this clip up now and play it.
That is that over her 11 months, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country widened substantially. How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics, she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, you would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich.
So that's it shows her incredible strength to be able to command the podium. But one thing that really stood out for me, and this might be just my modern day indoctrination, is here you have a very strong woman surrounded by a lot of men. There's not too many other women in the parliament that you can see in that clip. A lot of men crammed into that parliament, and she was commanding that parliament. We talk about commanding the narrative on this show, but she's commanding the parliament. She's commanding the nation in such a strong way. What part of her leadership qualities can we take away, and what part of her leadership qualities do we need to maybe what part of her leadership qualities are lacking in the Western world currently?
Well, she demonstrated honesty, determination, bravery. I mean, I was a different generation. I was decades younger than the Prime Minister and her cabinet colleagues when I became her chief policy advisor. So why did she take the risk? Why did she appoint me as a very young man? And she appointed me because in the years of preparation for a Conservative government, I had made the case for her and her shadow cabinet for privatisation. I said, it is the only way through. You're going to inherit a near bankrupt country. The Labour economic policy of the 70s was disastrous: high inflation, high taxation, Britain running out of money, brain drain, excessive taxation, 83% top rate of tax on so-called earned earnings and 98% of tax on other earnings. And I said, the only way you're going to get through this, and indeed there are lessons for today for some of these impecunious governments, is that you can't go in and slash health or education. These are very important services. You will need to spend more on those over the years. And you must be cutting taxes, not raising taxes. So what we need to do is sell off the assets of the state that are badly managed, that may be loss-making, that require an awful lot of extra capital, and take those risks into the private sector and allow those businesses to be liberated, to be put under properly accountable management that have to respond to the market and not to political pressures, and take them away from the public provision of easy finance. And that made a huge difference to the public finances throughout the 80s. It drove the Thatcher revolution in several ways. The immediate requirement was to free the state from the expenses of loss-making big nationalized industries, and to turn them in due course into profitable enterprises that pay tax. But there was also a huge economic benefit from that, because wherever we turned an industry away from monopoly public provision and got it opened up to competition and free enterprise capital, it expanded, it grew, it improved, it innovated, it created extra jobs. And so it reinforced the general message that free enterprise works. We didn't have enough free enterprise in Britain, and as we gradually added to it, so all would be well. It was very interesting that I've just received an email from a friend of mine who is a very good journalist and academic researcher who has written a history of the euro, and he's got very interested in my involvement in stopping the euro for Britain. And he was working away in the German archives, and he sent me a very interesting document copy from there. And they had carefully preserved a copy of my speech when I was city minister in the 1980s, setting out how the British stock market could take off if we went through Big Bang, and how we were putting in the infrastructure. But above all, I pointed out that we were liberating our telecommunications industry because our telecommunications nationalized industry didn't have the broadband, it didn't have the capacity, it didn't even have proper mobile telephony capability. It was a decade or more behind the United States of America. And in that speech was that cardinal point, amongst others, that our liberalization, freeing of the telephone industry and the attraction of huge private capital made a great financial market in the city possible. Whereas, as we now know, that was a correct prediction. If we had stuck with a monopoly industry that didn't have capacity, we wouldn't have had the great revolution in the city and all that wealth and income which it generated.
Leigh, do you would have remembered that time?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Do you want me to comment?
Yeah, if you have a comment, jump in.
I do. I was CEO of a young company at that time that Sir John is referring to. And in those days, British Telecom, as a nationalised industry, it took at least 6 weeks to get a new phone line put in.
Took me 6 months when I moved house.
Well, for a business, it was a minimum 6 weeks. I think in the end it took 8 weeks, something like that. Totally unacceptable. The reforms that Sir John was responsible for applying were absolutely crucial, and the privatization of organizations like British Telecom transformed the lives of people in the United Kingdom. And that is something I will never, ever forget. And unfortunately, and you may want to ask about this, Stephen, but unfortunately, there are signs that people have forgotten this, and that possibly the result of the next election in the UK will start taking us back to places that we don't want to be. And I'm non-partisan, as you know. I am simply talking for the majority of the British public.
Well, we need to make the case anew for free enterprise competition choice. And that is why I went in for this brief history lesson, because it is now a modern debate again. I mean, in the United Kingdom, I've been highlighting the lamentable performance of the remaining nationalised industries that were not privatised. And we've just seen the awful spectacle of the post office, nationalised throughout, mugging its employees and sending some of them to prison on trumped-up charges, which have now had to be quashed by Parliament. Appalling. And of course, there will then be a massive compensation bill which taxpayers will have to meet for the bad treatment of the staff. Nobody else mentions, but I always mention that the management which presided over this and got bonuses for their conduct also lost the taxpayers £1,400 million on their trading activities, as well as taking money off their sub-postmasters they weren't eligible to take. Or if we look at the Bank of England now, very grand, independent nationalised industry, but nonetheless nationally owned. The Bank of England has just sent an invoice for £49 billion to taxpayers to pay, which they have now paid, for its massive bond losses. And according to official estimates, there could be another 170 billion or so of losses to come, and they would all fall to be paid for by taxpayers. Well, this is runaway outrage, which has a very direct impact on the public finances and the capacity of the British state to serve the public well as of today. And then you look at our rail system in Britain, which is now largely renationalised or nationalised. The main renationalisation occurred under Labour in 2002 after a successful decade or so of expansion of passengers and better performance under privatisation. And that has cost the taxpayer in the last year, capital and revenue losses combined, £33 billion for a transport system that only accounts for about 7 or 8% of our total transport activities. Again, this is unaffordable and it is unreasonable because it is bad management. And that bad management flows from the complete lack of competitive challenge, whereas it is quite possible, as we demonstrated in a couple of minor instances to introduce competition, which would improve service and lower costs.
When I was growing up, we had John Howard was the Prime Minister, and Peter Costello was the Treasurer, and they were a Liberal government, which Liberal in Australia is essentially Conservative. And they were very good economic managers, and they took over from the Keating government that had taken us into a lot of debt, and they were able to repay that debt and then also have a surplus at the end of it. And part of that was the privatization of Telecom, which is our communication network. It's now known as Telstra. The old adage used to be that the Labor governments would spend and they would get us into debt, and then the Liberal government or the Conservative government would then come in and save the day. That hasn't been happening here in Australia in recent times, especially since COVID. The Liberal government just extended the debt. It's happening elsewhere, such as in America. Why do you think that Conservative governments have moved away from their economic sensibilities?
Well, I think COVID knocked them all sideways, and they all accepted, or with the exception of a few like Sweden, the global establishment advice that you needed to lock down everybody. Those of us who said there were other ways of protecting those at risk, and you didn't need to lock down so much for so long, were ignored, and we were minor opposition. And once you accepted that, you couldn't say to a quarter or more of the employed public, you're not going to be allowed to go to work and there won't be any money to pay you. And so the state had to step in and supply the income that was missing. If they hadn't done that, there would have been a massive economic crash, and it could have led to a banking crash as well. So even people like me were saying that, of course, if you're going to do these lockdowns, yes, you have to intervene across the piece, because this is such a major change in the way we conduct business. But I think they then got hooked on this idea of continuous intervention. And so instead of withdrawing it promptly and getting us back to work promptly, they then went into their inflation and Ukraine war energy crunch. And the cry went up again, well, why don't we cushion everybody? So then more money was spent on doing that. And before you knew where you were, these advanced countries were taking on extremely large debts. Now, of course, in America, it also coincided with the change of president. So Biden takes over, and he came in as a matter of policy, wanting to expand public expenditure, public investment, and public debt. And he's done it on a huge scale. And so the United States of America has been in a paradoxical position that the central bank made the same mistakes there as were made in Europe and Britain, with an ultra-lax monetary policy for too long, accommodating far too much for too long. And then they lurched all together to have a very tough policy. But in America, Biden decided to offset all of that with this huge largesse through his so-called Inflation Reduction Act, a paradoxical title at best. And it actually worked in terms of cushioning the American economy from the downturns that the others experienced when you launched monetary tightness. But there will be a price for that. And the price is very visible in the very high continuing budget deficits in America, despite the pretty high level of output and activity. And the 10-year budget forecasts, which they do in America, do look dreadful, because they show this continuing for a decade, whoever is in office. And then the interest bill becomes very great. So yes, I think there is an issue. I think the advanced countries are moving towards a much more protectionist, subsidized, government knows best approach. And that will prove very costly. And at different times, for different reasons, different countries will stumble and discover there are limits to the patience of savers and markets, and that they will need to make adjustments to what is otherwise excessive debt buildup.
Leigh, do you have any comments on the situation in the UK at the moment with inflation?
No, I think Sir John's pretty much nailed it. Where he's been very strong is on the influence of the Bank of England and an organisation that we have called the Office for Budget Responsibility. I'm not sure whether Australia has an equivalent to the latter. You've certainly got an equivalent to the Bank of England. But Sir John has been a powerful voice in questioning the decisions of the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility, both of which influence the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a very serious way. And maybe you want to ask Sir John about how that works in the UK, because it may have parallels in Australia, I don't know. But the forecasts that have been made have been, to call them erroneous would be an understatement.
Well, of course, an election is coming up in the UK, and there's a possibility of a Labor government, which would only, in my imagination, would increase spending even more. You wrote this paper not long ago, Sir John. It's I'll bring it up here. It's called The Great Inflation. And here in Australia, at least, I can comment, the amount of debt that we are in has pushed up inflation, in my view. And now the central banks are stepping in and raising interest rates to try and bring that inflation down. But I don't see that being the problem. It's not the spending of the individual people that's driven inflation. It's the government spending. When it comes to inflation, are there control mechanisms to be able to suppress inflation or control it?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, the way you suppress it is exactly what the central banks have been doing. You have to reduce or slow the rate of growth of money and credit in the economy as a whole. And if your main problem has been created by excessive monetary creation within the public sector in the first instance, which is the situation we're now talking about, you obviously have to sort that out. But if you lurch too rapidly from printing too much money, buying too many bonds, depressing interest rates too far, to a situation where interest rates are penally high, you are reducing the amount of money and credit in circulation, and you have turned off the tap of official money, then you will jerk the economy into recession. And we've seen all too many of these boom-bust cycles, certainly over my adult lifetime, and bad central banking has often been an important part of that. It can be made worse by bad fiscal policy by governments. Sometimes it can be created by bad fiscal policy by governments if you have a government bad enough, as we did with the Labour government in the 1970s, for example. So yes, we are witnessing this, and the central banks of the United Kingdom and of Europe and of America have, I think, lurched from far too permissive and too lax to surprisingly tight. In America, it has been offset by fiscal policy. In Europe, they are trying to offset a bit of it by fiscal policy, but they don't have the same liberty to borrow on the scale that America does. And it's a very unhappy situation. Now, I have never challenged the principle that the British Central Bank, which is said to be independent, should keep its independence to make a forecast of inflation and the economy in its own way as it sees fit, and based on that forecast to choose the short-term rates, the base rates for the monetary system as a whole. I think it was a great pity the Bank of England lost its main controlling activities over individual large commercial banks, because they are very important credit creators and they are therefore part of the story. But the Bank of England, the Fed, and to a lesser extent the ECB don't really seem to believe that money and credit matters very much, or they think it's derived from other factors. And they have models for forecasting the economy that patently don't work and leave them very exposed in missing what other people can see by looking at money and credit. There's going to be an inflation. If we take the Bank of England, who presided over an inflation that peaked at 11%, if you look at their forecast 2 years before the 11% came about, their 2-year forecast, and that is their main horizon for forecasting, was for a 2% rate. And it was 11%, more 5.5 times the target rate and the forecast rate. How did they get it that wrong? Well, they said, oh, well, we got it that wrong because we didn't foresee a war in Ukraine, and the war came along and the energy prices shot up, and that could have happened to anybody. So I pointed out that the rate of inflation had already trebled from 2 to 6% before Putin moved his troops into Ukraine. And that implied that there are other things going on here, and maybe their excessive money and credit had something to do with it. Anyway, they've now honed their activities a bit, and I think they now say, oh, there must have been some inflation from lockdown as well as from the war in Ukraine. So they say we've had two extraneous shocks. Don't deny that. And yes, of course, they put up the prices of individual things quite a lot. But if you hadn't had such accommodative money, there wouldn't have been a general inflation. People would have had tougher choices, and you might have wanted to ease that in some way. But they allowed a very inflationary environment at the point where there are supply shocks. And so, yes, of course, the biggest inflationary pressures in the first instance were felt in energy, for example. But then they washed over because the whole thing was too permissive. Now the thing is not permissive, in some cases not permissive enough. The inflation has come barreling down exactly the way that you would expect if you took money and credit seriously. So I'm trying to get them to take money and credit more seriously. And it's the case that a limited number of economists and forecasters outside the bank have had a much better track record explaining there was going to be a big up and a big down than the Bank of England have done with their different model. And one of the former governors has been sensibly outspoken in Britain. And he said the other day that one of the reasons that their forecasting went wrong was that apparently the bank in their forecast lay a lot of stress on inflation expectations. And because they have a 2% target, and because everybody knows they intend to get inflation back to 2% at the 2-year point of the forecast, they put into their model that it's very likely to be back at 2% at the 2-year point. So they think it's self-validating. But sometimes you look out the front window and you discover that isn't the world you're living in.
I've got a comment in the chat. You might be able to answer this. It's from Adam Zara. He says, what happens if a country actually pays off all debt and starts to put money in the bank and can live and thrive off its own revenue, in essence, leaving the Reserve Bank unnecessary? Obviously, the Reserve Bank here in Australia is our central bank. It's the Bank of England in the UK.
Sure. Well, I don't quite agree with that, because I think you still need a monetary policy and a central bank involved looking over the work of the commercial banks, because if the state is not borrowing, it's very likely the private sector will be borrowing, and there are still issues about the pace and extent of the increase in debt and credit extended throughout the private sector. And more normally, the private sector is the main demander of extra credit, but we've been living through extraordinary times where not only have state organizations, central banks, printed a lot of money, but they've also spent that money on debt from the public sector, allowing the state to spend far more than it would normally do by keeping interest rates very low and making the state feel it was onto a bargain here. But then, of course, the savage swing upwards in interest charges is now doing huge damage to the states themselves, because having lived through this period where they were able to borrow at near zero, and that this was all underpinned by central bank action, they're now living in a world where if they want to roll over or borrow extra, they're going to have to borrow 5% or something. It's a very different proposition. And as their debt rolls over, so the debt gets progressively dearer, because the cheap debt they borrowed in the good times has to be replaced as dear debt. So there will still be a role for a reserve bank or a central bank, even if the state managed to repay all its debts. But the other thing, I've got bad news for you. I don't think most of these states are anywhere near paying off their state debt. And if they tried to pay it off in a hurry, it would be crippling to themselves and the economy and to taxpayers. So that these things have to be taken at a sensible pace. My final observation is that the best way to get state debt down in relation to the wealth and economic health of the country is, of course, economic growth. And most governments know this, but quite a lot of them adopt policies that achieve the opposite, because you do not get faster growth if you put taxes on the private sector too high. If you have wild credit swings with very wild interest rate swings, because you have unreliable central banking or unreliable fiscal policy. And you do not get fast growth if you allow a huge amount of money to be tipped into the public services and public organizations without demanding accountability, value for money, and profits from those that are trading and charging people real prices.
I'm glad that you brought up taxation, because I've often heard people say, well, maybe not that often, but I have heard it said that if you were to lower taxes, you actually bring in more revenue. Is that true? And if that is true, why are governments so addicted to taxation to pay off debt?
I think most sensible governments accept that Laffer's excellent work on the so-called Laffer curve can be appropriate. Laffer said that if you take a particular tax rate down, you may collect more revenue because there may be more transactions or there may be more income generated as a result. Well, it takes some obvious cases. When the United Kingdom took the marginal tax rate on high earnings down from 83% to 40%, the revenue from rich people shot up because more rich people came to Britain. A lot of the brain drain reversed. More people who were rich ventured more or did more exciting things with their money, which in turn generated more money and created more jobs. And so the whole process was revenue generating, because an 83% income tax rate is almost confiscation. And you will get considerably less revenue, and you'll have far fewer rich people staying and paying, or you'll have rich people staying and employing extremely good tax accountants and lawyers to find ways of legally not paying the money. So if you can see it in an extreme case, you've then got a difficult task with each tax to say, well, are we at the point where if we cut the rate, we would still collect more revenue, or are we at the point, which is more normal, where you could get extra revenue if we increase the rate? And you've got to look at it tax by tax. Some taxes are much more susceptible to big loss of revenue if you raise them too high. I mean, let's take another obvious one, capital gains tax. If you impose a capital gains tax, as many advanced countries have now done, if you put it a bit high, then a very large number of savers will say, I'm not going to sell my assets. I'm only going to sell the amount that is permitted at the tax-free level, or I will limit my sales so that the tax bill is not disproportionate. And it means that a lot of people will hold assets they're not that keen on or may not be performing that well, because if you impose a large capital gains tax on the sale, you then need to have an extraordinarily good investment as a replacement to recoup all the lost tax. And so a high capital gains tax will mean far fewer transactions of assets, and it will mean far less good management of assets, because often the way to get them better managed is to sell them on to an owner who knows how to improve them.
And the Western world at the moment seems to be addressing the economic concerns through immigration. And it's been argued that high immigration is used by modern Western governments to drive economic growth, but it's not actually, in a per capita reasoning, we're actually in a recession. Brexit was something that was massive over in the UK, and it was something that Leigh was very heavily involved with, and also yourself, Sir John. What is the current situation in the UK with immigration? Did Brexit address the immigration concerns of the UK?
Well, you're right that was part of the argument, although perhaps not the main argument, but maybe a fifth of the electorate felt very passionately that we didn't want free movement anymore with the continent, and there have been large numbers coming in from Europe under free movement. And the answer is yes, that did stop. Free movement was abolished, and the numbers coming in from Europe now are reduced. A lot of people were, of course, allowed to stay who'd already come, because we're a generous and sensible country. But at the same time, the government allowed a very large expansion in non-EU migration, and that was a voluntary choice of government and parliament. Some of it was for very good reasons, wanted to be decent to the people of Ukraine, because a lot of people wanted to leave Ukraine because they didn't want their children exposed to a war zone and so forth. There was a special situation in Hong Kong where the Chinese authorities got much tougher over the way they ran Hong Kong. And so, given our past associations, we obviously invited a lot of Hong Kong people who had links to Britain to be able to come to Britain. So there were some special issues. But there was then a realization in Britain that this isn't what people had voted for. We hadn't voted for a huge increase in migration from non-EU. And so after debate, this government has now put in changes to the system so that you need to come for a job at a higher level of income than was being allowed before, and has changed some of the requirements over access for students and so forth, and has started to get the numbers down, but they are still at a very elevated level, and they're still a matter for considerable public debate. But at least now that is an option which a British government can choose to settle for itself. But you're absolutely right, Stephen, that like you, I don't think it's a win to increase your GDP by less than you've increased the population and to take credit for the population growth. And if you invite in a lot of people as economic migrants to do very low-paid jobs that people in our own countries don't want to do, that is not very fair on them, and it's not fair on everybody else. What we need to do in Britain and Australia, certainly in Britain, is go to a high-wage, high-productivity economy. And so where we have labour shortages, maybe the jobs aren't properly defined, maybe there isn't enough capital and machinery support, maybe there are ways that you can do things better and end up with staff coming out of your own pool of unemployed or underemployed onto better paid jobs that can deal with the problem. And that must be even more true now, because with artificial intelligence and the digital revolution, it's possible to make office jobs so much more interesting. And as they become more interesting, there will be more management and skill content, and then you can pay them more because the automation is doing much of the traditional low-paid work. And when it comes to something more difficult, something like agriculture, for example, surely the answer there, certainly in the very mixed climate of the United Kingdom, is to back massive investment in lots of glass houses or other means, so that you can take the weather out of it and you can grow crops in a way that are much more accessible for easy picking or for machine picking, so that you automate much more of the process. You have more crops a year, you have a higher quality, you control the amount of water and fertilizer and other input you need to make. This surely is the way to go in what some people say you cannot automate. But I think vegetable and fruit growing is a very good example where the best technology now transforms the situation and doesn't need the same armies of underpaid labour.
Another part of Brexit was that it essentially moved Britain away from having to trade solely with the the European Union. How do you think that will change the relationship with Australia, especially with trade going forward?
Well, I think it's very positive, and I think that's been one of the obvious successes. The Remain campaign, as it was called, the pro-EU campaign in the United Kingdom, just concentrated on trade and said that we would be damaging our trade with Europe, and our trade with Europe was very big and the only trade that really mattered, and that was their main reason for being negative. And I and other Brexiteers said, we won't lose all our trade with Europe. There will be a free trade deal with Europe, as there has, of course, been. But there will be all sorts of opportunities to open up more free trade agreements with the rest of the world. They countered by saying, oh, but the EU has already got a series of deals with quite a lot of the rest of the world, although, of course, it didn't have one with the United States of America, our biggest single market outside Britain, and it didn't have one with the TPP. And we said, well, we'll just roll those over. Oh, no, you won't. Anyway, of course, we rolled over every one because all the partners said, yes, we don't want to exclude Britain. But even better was some very sensibly said, well, the EU deal was rather limited because it, on the whole, for example, said very little or nothing about services, and Britain's main export is services. And so we were often able to either put a service chapter into the rollover, or we will be putting a service chapter in as the relationship develops. So I and my friends are very positive. I think more people in Britain are coming to see that the scares run were false. We have rolled over all of the trade arrangements. We can improve quite a lot of them. We've demonstrated by being the first new recruit to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we can join in such an exciting venture fairly early on and make an important contribution to that. And so I think it's teeming with opportunity. And one of the reasons I disliked our period in the European Economic Community, which became the European Union, was I think Britain treated Australia, New Zealand, Canada and others very badly when we went into the European Economic Community. I think you've all been very understanding about that. And I think it's wonderful that we can repair the damage and have a much better future to look forward to.
Well, it's I think it's needed in the modern world. I mean, there's from Australia. I think there's a lot of goodwill towards the whole Commonwealth, not just Britain itself, but all Commonwealth nations. There's a unity there, and it seems like the Commonwealth has fallen on hard times, you might say, because doesn't seem as strong as it used to be, or at least the bonds are not as strong as they used to be. Is there potential there to rebuild the Commonwealth?
Well, I think there definitely is, and it must be a modern Commonwealth with a variety of leaders, because we've moved on a long way from the origins of it all. I think the late Queen was a very important force for keeping it together. I think the King has a great opportunity. I think he is a well-wisher of it, and we wish him a speedy return to full duties, and I think he can make an important contribution to this, but so can other leaders from other leading countries in the Commonwealth, and it is our joint Commonwealth, and you will all contribute to where you want it to go. But I think it should continue to be a beacon for democracy and for freer trade and for good relations between countries that like each other and want to get on in the world. And of course, there will be subdivisions, because clearly the United Kingdom is now very involved with Australia in defence matters, along with the United States of America and with Japan, and where we need to be, because we are global looking as the United Kingdom. We have serious defence forces and the contribution we can make, and we wish to do that. We've just announced we're going to strengthen those defence forces and spend more on them, and I think rightly so. And we do see, particularly now we're joining the TPP, that the future security of the South China Sea and the wider oceans near to Australia matter very much to us, just as we're keen to keep the British Channel open for all vessels.
Leigh, you were obviously very involved in Brexit, as I just said, and you're probably very well connected with Sir John at the time. Do you have any comments on where the UK is now that Brexit has happened, and what opportunities would you like to talk about as UK essentially moves into a new period of its history?
Yeah, I would simply ask Sir John about we've achieved. Would he agree that we've achieved a partial Brexit, but that we've left behind a part of the United Kingdom, that is Northern Ireland, that is still subject to EU laws? And would he also agree that the original plan by the British government to repeal all EU laws by the end of last year, whether they were right or wrong, was the right policy?
Well, I mean, Leigh is right to say that there is some buyer's remorse in the United Kingdom, but we're not about to have a reverse referendum and keep trying to swap around. And why on earth would they want us back, given that we were a very reluctant member, refused to join the euro, rightly in my view, and then I think did the decent thing and say, you want a federal state, you want a full union. This is not ready for the United Kingdom. But I say to my fellow citizens and fellow Brexit voters, be of good cheer, because whilst government, for good and bad reasons, has not taken full advantage of the opportunities and the freedoms we now enjoy, we do have that constitutional right to make changes and make things better in the future that we didn't have all the time we're in the European Union. More importantly, positive things that have been achieved. We've already talked a bit about how we have more trade deals now, with the opportunity of much better and stronger trade deals in areas like services, which matter crucially to us and increasingly to our counterparties. One that most people forget is that the European Union is now going on a bonanza of raising its own debt. It was something which Britain, along with Germany, restrained them from doing, and Germany now either doesn't have the strength to restrain them or doesn't have the will to restrain them. And so Britain has ducked a mountain of new debt that we would have been jointly and individually liable for. It's going to be a short €1 trillion in the immediate programs of borrowing. So our share would have been 150 billion or something. And we really can't afford to take on all that extra debt. So I say to my fellow countrymen and women, that was good bullet to dodge. And then, although we haven't got rid of as many of the old EU laws as I'd have liked, they were all just transferred into British law as a block deal. There are probably another 7,000 laws, regulations and decisions taken since we left the European Union, and we've ducked all those, and I think we're going to be better off without them rather than with them. On Leigh's particular point, yes, I and my friends had persuaded the government to put through a piece of legislation. It wouldn't have dumped them all, Leigh. It was going to say that by a deadline, the government either had to have said these are definitely worth keeping and gone through a fairly simple process to keep them, otherwise the others lapsed. So it wasn't quite as dramatic as Leigh is suggesting. And I thought it was a good piece of legislation. It passed the Commons very easily. The Conservatives all voted for it and it was a good majority. But then the incoming government, Mr. Sunak, decided that it might be a bit difficult in the Lords and they didn't want to proceed in that way. So I think that was a pity. And as Leigh rightly says, there was always a difficulty over Northern Ireland, and there's now been an attempt to resolve that through something called the Windsor Framework. But I and my friends are critical of that because it does mean that more of these laws apply in Northern Ireland than now apply in the rest of the United Kingdom, and that we find a difficult idea.
I want to bring up a book that you wrote. It's called We Don't Believe You, Why Populists Reject the Establishment. Now, we see in different areas of the world, you have Nigel Farage running around in the UK picking up support. You have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the United States of America picking up support. You could almost argue that Donald Trump is riding the populist movement. Here in Australia are two major parties that have been around forever, getting primary votes in the low 30s and they're drifting into the 20s. What is happening with Western leadership? The establishment has become a bad word, a dirty word almost, but you've been in the parliament since 1987, and I guess whether you like it or not, you've been part of the establishment. The establishment can do a lot of good, provided that it is representing the constituents effectively. What needs to happen to get more faith back into politics amongst the voters?
Well, the main parties where they are losing it with the electorate have to understand why they're losing it with the electorate. You're quite right. I think Trump is a very good example of campaigning against the establishment and against the world order as he sees it, because he picks up the frustration of people because they don't feel the international trade order was doing a good job for them because it allowed China to, as they see it, take their jobs away from America. He was against the World Health Organization because some people felt their intervention producing one particular answer to the COVID problems was not necessarily the right answer and was quite difficult. So these world government examples annoy people because they feel it's directly having an adverse impact on their jobs or their health or their government's approach to life. And where you've got proportional representation systems, as you have on the continent of Europe, then it destroys the traditional parties. We've seen a pattern in the last 30 or 40 years of more and more powers gravitating to the EU level and gravitating to the world level, people not liking the results of this mixture of policy. And so Christian Democrat parties and Social Democrat parties that commanded maybe 40% each, typically in elections in the last century, command very little or can even be destroyed. And in some countries, like Italy and Greece, we've been through several iterations where either a centre-right or a centre-left dominant party is being destroyed. There's been a successor party, and then sometimes a successor party still gets it wrong and they get destroyed because PR allows that to happen more easily. And we've just seen again an establishment party which had a minority share of the vote already swept out of power in the Netherlands because they backed net zero policies far too vigorously and were trying to take an awful lot of livestock off the farms prematurely and really annoyed not just the farmers, but the food buyers and the general public. So I think what you've got to look at is what are the policies that the world elite are signing up to that most annoy people. We spent quite a lot of time discussing bad central banking, which has been affecting quite a lot of Western economies, and people don't like their living standards being badly hit by a rapid inflation, and then they don't like their mortgages being hit by a big increase in interest rates. So there was quite a lot of commonality in the policy mistakes made by the leading central banks, so-called independent bodies, which has been very unpopular. I think a bigger area now is the whole approach to net zero. And I've been speaking and writing quite a lot about that, as Leigh knows. And I've been making one very simple point. I've been saying this can only go at the pace the public wants it to go at. And the public are probably wiser on this than these go anywhere on somebody else's money governments. And what we're seeing is governments are trying to force us to buy electric cars before we want to buy them, force us to dump the gas boiler and put in a heat pump before they're affordable or realistic in many cases, trying to get us all onto smart meters so that they can flex prices and introduce limitations on fuel when people aren't ready for that. They just like a plentiful supply at a relatively sensible price. So there is this huge tension between the establishment in a hurry to deliver net zero and decarbonisation by any means and willing to spend huge subsidies, introduce bans and regulations that have a direct impact on people's lives. And there's the public who say, yeah, we're good environmentalists and we're a bit worried and we want to do things, but it's got to be with affordable, sensible answers. Indeed, quite a lot of the answers that the keenest net zero governments and parties are recommending don't even work in their own terms. Because if, for example, in the United Kingdom, I did go and find the money to buy an electric car to pension off my diesel car, I would plug it in tonight. There's hardly any wind in the United Kingdom at all at the moment. And they would have to burn more gas in a gas power station for me to be able to recharge my car. Well, how does that make any useful contribution whatsoever? Because I might as well burn the gas or the equivalent of the gas, in this case diesel, directly in my car. It'd be more efficient than relying on a power station and all the losses in transmission of the power and charging up the battery and all the rest of it. And another more obvious one, where I've had some success in influencing policy in the United Kingdom, and that is that we were on course to close down our North Sea oil and gas prematurely by not licensing the new reserves that are out there. There will be some decline, but there are some reserves out there. But the alternative was to import liquefied natural gas from America or Qatar. Well, that generates far more CO2 for the world than if we get our own gas down a pipe. So that was just completely crazy. And I'm very pleased the government said, yes, we agree with that. We're now going to license some more gas fields. Pity we haven't got more gas.
Well, Sir John, it's been an absolute honour to be able to interview you tonight. It's your morning there, but nighttime here in Australia.
Stephen,
one final.
Can I just say something before you do your closing speech?
Well, yep, sure. I was going to ask one final question, but go for it, Leigh.
Okay, it was just really to say that, well, two things. Number one, well, you'll do the thanks to Sir John, but isn't it interesting how some of the points that he's raising are exactly the points that are concerning Australian citizens and citizens around the world. And therefore, these kinds of broadcasts are incredibly important. That was the first thing I wanted to say. Second thing, very briefly, was to all my Australian friends, we love you and we're very sorry for what happened in the 1970s, but welcome home. And we're delighted with the trade agreement. We're very sorry that the EU will not do a trade agreement with you. I think that's an important thing to mention, but the UK has. We're also delighted with the AUKUS agreement on submarines, and we will back and support you. And you need to hear this from somebody that gets enormous numbers of emails every day from ordinary members of the public. And I'm quite certain Sir John will back me in everything that I've said. That's it.
Well, I did want to finish off, Sir John, and it's probably good that Leigh did bring up what happened in the 1970s with the UK becoming part of the European Union. And there was a referendum in the 1970s that actually lost. It was essentially a Brexit in the 70s that lost, and it lost quite it lost well. You've been in Parliament since 1987. My political journey has been since basically the COVID lockdown. So I've only been in it for maybe 2 or 3 years, and in that time, I've met a lot of disillusioned voters, a lot of people that are very frustrated with the political system and the direction of Australia and the world at the moment. But as we can see with Brexit, it did take decades for the pendulum to switch. And you've probably learnt this lesson being in the Parliament for so long, that it is really a long game, politics, and you need to stick out your message quite a long time before you get any traction or success. What advice can you give to people listening that are very disillusioned with the direction things are going at the moment? Can things turn around if you just keep chipping away?
Yes, indeed they can. And you don't need to be in a parliament to help chip away. It's sometimes someone outside parliament that makes the big breakthrough, captures the public imagination, gets a word in the air of someone who can make a different decision, or just creates the momentum. First of all, a very big thank you to Leigh. He does fantastic work in the United Kingdom and wider, and very proud of all that he's achieved, and he's kept the flame alive, and I'm glad he's promoting good relations with Australia. I did, I think, earlier apologise to Australia for what my fellow countrymen and women did in the early 1970s. It was one of the first democratic votes I was old enough to make when I was a very young man, and I'm pleased to tell you I voted against staying in the European Economic Community. I was asked by the firm I was working for to write a report on the economic consequences. I thought it was a genuine question, so I wrote a report explaining that they would be negative. Almost lost my job over it because all the establishment knew that it was going to be a very good thing. But I stuck to my guns, and unfortunately, a lot of what I said about the unreasonably high contributions Britain would have to make and the asymmetric freeing of trade to allow them to sell the things to us they were good at, but not allow us to sell the things we were good at to them, turned out to be all too true. So we ran into massive balance payments deficit, which was very predictable. So not all campaigns have to take a long time. I think when you start a campaign, you should want it to be a short and effective one. And the more volume and the more resource you can throw into it, the better, because then you can create a tide. And if the wave gets too high, they may have to deal with it. But sometimes it takes a long time. It did take a long time to get the whole of the country around to the view that the European Economic Community, which morphed predictably into the European Union, was not for us. But I mean, the first really big success on that front I had came in the late 1990s, when there was huge pressure on the United Kingdom to join the euro and give up the pound. And so I did quite a lot of the campaigning. I wrote the books and articles, thought up some of the phrases, went around the country with others saying, for goodness sake, don't ditch the pound. Indeed, changing the language round, because the establishment was saying, wouldn't it be nice to join the euro? I was saying, no, it wouldn't be good to ditch the pound. That made quite a difference, and the public was much more on my side and our side when you phrased it in that way, and then spelling out the consequences. And I think the best I ever did was I put out a phrase which said, joining a single currency is like taking out a bank account with your neighbor. I get on very well with my neighbors, but I just fear if I shared a bank account with them, they'd run up the overdraft and leave me short of money. And that took off. And the more that the other side, pro-euro, tried to counter it, the better it was for me, because they had much more purchase than I had to get a message out. So that was what one had to argue. And they thought it was an unfair comparison. But when you then saw what happened to the euro, it turned out to be exactly that a whole load of free-riding, heavily borrowed states were trading off the back of Germany, which in those days was very prudent and lightly borrowed. And it became quite an issue between Germany and the southern states. So, as we all say, there's huge possibilities from Australian and British cooperation and friendship. There's the Five Eyes grouping on intelligence, as well as the defence and trade matters we've mentioned. So It's been a privilege to talk to you all this evening in Australia. And I will be speaking, writing, talking, setting out views which may be of interest to you over the weeks and months ahead. And johnredwood.com, my daily diary, is there free of charge and part of the service.
I was just about, funnily enough, to step in and promote that for you, John. I can recommend it to Australian viewers. Not every single piece will be relevant to you. There are some about Sir John's own constituency. But over the years, in my experience, probably one of the most interesting sources of thought is available there. And it's johnredwood.com or johnredwoodsdiary.com. And I would also recommend his books as well. And I'm not paid to do this, by the way. But he's written some tremendous books, and they are relevant, I think, around the world. Anyway, just very briefly, this is Steven's show. I just wanted to say my personal thank you to Sir John for doing this, because getting the message out around the world for things that an awful lot of people believe in is, I think, incredibly important. So, Stephen, thank you for providing this platform. Sir John, thank you for giving us your expertise. Back to you, Stephen.
And if you also want to follow Sir John on X, you can. He's got a big following there, so head to X and you can follow him, and you can also follow him on Facebook as well. So obviously the website's the first port of call, but he's also got those two social media platforms as well. So John, one final question. I have to ask this question. Have you ever been to Australia?
Yes, I have indeed. Indeed, I used to be responsible for a business in Australia when I was making tiles and other things through a large international business I chaired, and we had a facility in Melbourne, so I used to go to see that.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. And we'd love to have you back at some point in the future, and good luck with everything that you've will do moving forward. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to interview you tonight. And as I said, everyone watching, please head to johnredwoodsdiary.com and also his X account and Facebook. And please share this out. Please share it far and wide. It's very important that our audience helps us in getting this message out there. I think Sir John is a great intellect and raised some very important policy issues tonight. I wish a lot of Australian politicians would watch this interview and get some ideas from Sir John, and I'm sure they'd be able to give him a call and get some policy ideas. I wish they would do that, but that will remain to be seen. But yeah, please share it out. It's very important. And I mean, I think tonight's interview goes to show that we are building a lot of networks, a lot of communities, a lot of conduits are happening, not only here in Australia, but also it's starting to go around the world, to the UK and hopefully to other countries as well. And we can really draw upon the knowledge of each other to better the Western world and the greater world as well. So thank you everyone who has watched tonight, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.